They thought they could walk all over him, literally. When Mark Green found his immaculate lawn destroyed by his neighbor Kevin's car, it wasn't just disrespectful, it was personal. And when Mark confronted him, Kevin's response was a smug laugh and a dismissive, "It's just grass, relax." But Kevin didn't stop there. He escalated, parking more cars and mocking Mark's every attempt to reason with him. Kevin thought he was untouchable, but he underestimated Mark's quiet determination. Mark had a plan, clever, legal, and impossible to ignore. What happened next shocked the entire neighborhood, but to understand how Mark turned the tables, we need to start at the beginning. The morning was serene, just as Mark Green loved it. Sunlight poured through the blinds of his living room, casting a golden glow on the wooden floor. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air, and the faint giggles of his 2 children echoed from the backyard. For Mark, this quiet corner of the suburbs was more than just a house. It was a sanctuary he had worked tirelessly to provide for his family. Mark took a sip of his coffee and glanced out the window to admire the lush green lawn he had spent countless weekends tending. The grass was perfect, vivid and healthy, like an emerald carpet that framed their home. That lawn wasn't just grass. It was pride, proof of his dedication to building the ideal life for his family. But his moment of peace shattered like glass against pavement when he noticed something unusual. Right there, smack in the middle of his pristine lawn, was a car. Not his car, not his wife's car. A beat-up sedan with mud-streaked tires and a broken taillight sat there as if it had every right to be there. Mark blinked, hoping he was imagining things. No, the car was real, its weight sinking into the soft ground. Tire marks carved messy tracks across the grass, crushing the plants he'd carefully nurtured. His heart sank. This wasn't a small inconvenience. It was a violation of his space, his effort, his peace. Setting his mug down, Mark stepped outside. The crisp morning air did little to cool the fire building in his chest. He walked up to the car, inspecting the damage to his lawn. The soil was gouged, the grass flattened. How could someone be so careless? The sound of a door opening drew his attention. From the neighboring house, a man in his late 40s emerged, wearing a smug grin. His name was Kevin, a neighbor Mark had barely spoken to since moving in. Kevin strolled over, hands in his pockets as if he were greeting an old friend. "Morning, Mark," Kevin said, nodding toward the car. "Hope it's not a problem, just needed a spot to park for a bit." Mark stared at him, struggling to keep his tone civil. "Kevin, this is my lawn. You can't just park here." Kevin shrugged, his grin unwavering. "It's just grass. No big deal, I'll move it later." "No big deal?" Mark's jaw tightened. Did Kevin not see the mess he had made? The blatant disrespect? "It is a big deal," Mark replied, his voice firm. "This is private property. Please move your car now." But Kevin just chuckled, brushing off the seriousness of Mark's words. "Relax, buddy. I'll take care of it. Don't stress over a patch of grass." And with that, Kevin turned and walked back inside his house, leaving Mark standing there, frustration bubbling like a pot on the verge of boiling over. Back inside, Mark tried to focus on his work, but the image of that car on his lawn was seared into his mind. By midday, it was still there, its tires sinking deeper into the ground. Mark's frustration turned to determination. He scribbled a polite note, explaining once again that the lawn was private property and asking Kevin to respect it. He placed the note under the windshield wiper and waited. The next morning, Mark woke up to find the car gone, and the note crumpled in the corner of his yard. Relief was short-lived, though. By the afternoon, the car was back, accompanied by a second one. 2 cars, on his lawn. Mark couldn't believe the audacity, It was as if Kevin was daring him to do something about it. He stormed over to Kevin's house and knocked on the door. Kevin opened it, holding a beer, his smug grin firmly in place. "Kevin, I'm not asking anymore," Mark said, his voice sharp. "Move the cars. Now." Kevin tilted his head, feigning confusion. "I don't see what the big deal is. It's not like you're using the lawn for anything important." Mark's fists clenched at his sides. "It's not about that. It's about respect. This is my property, and I'm asking you to stop treating it like your personal parking lot." Kevin smirked, leaning against the doorframe. "If it's such a big deal, why don't you put up a fence? Or maybe, I don't know, learn to share." Share. The nerve of this man. Mark turned and walked away before his anger got the better of him. He wasn't going to stoop to Kevin's level. There had to be a better way to handle this. That evening, as Mark sat with his wife Emma, he vented his frustrations. Emma, always the voice of reason, suggested calling the local authorities. "They can't park on your property without permission," she said. "There has to be something they can do." Mark nodded, grateful for her support. The next day, he called the town's code enforcement office. But when he explained the situation, the response was disheartening. "Unfortunately, there's no specific ordinance against parking on private lawns," the official explained. "Since it's your property, it's considered a civil matter. You'll need to address it with your neighbor directly." Mark hung up, his hope deflated. Kevin clearly wasn't going to listen to reason, and the authorities couldn't intervene. He felt trapped, powerless in his own home. And yet, giving up wasn't an option. His lawn wasn't just grass, it was a symbol of everything he had worked for. He had to find a way to protect it, no matter what. As the sun set that evening, Mark stood by the window, staring at the cars on his lawn. His mind raced with possibilities. He didn't know how yet, but he vowed to put an end to this. Kevin might have started this war, but Mark wasn't about to lose. Little did Kevin know, Mark had a plan, and it was going to make him regret ever parking on that lawn. Mark's frustration simmered as the day dragged on. He had hoped the polite note tucked under the windshield wiper would be enough to send a clear message. After all, it wasn't unreasonable to expect a neighbor to respect the boundaries of private property. Yet, when he stepped outside the next morning, the sight of Kevin's car parked brazenly on his lawn again greeted him. To make matters worse, the note he had written was crumpled into a ball and discarded near his driveway, like a piece of trash. Mark clenched his jaw, feeling a wave of anger rise in his chest. He tried to shake it off, but the audacity of the act was impossible to ignore. Kevin hadn't just ignored his polite request. He had dismissed it entirely, as if Mark's concerns didn't matter. It wasn't just a matter of parking anymore. It was a matter of respect. Mark resolved to confront Kevin face to face. This time, he wouldn't leave room for misinterpretation. That afternoon, Mark walked across the yard to Kevin's house, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and determination. As he knocked on the door, he rehearsed what he would say in his head. He wanted to be firm but not combative, clear but not aggressive. After all, they were neighbors, and he didn't want to escalate the situation unnecessarily. Kevin answered the door with a beer in one hand and a smug grin on his face. "Well, hey there, Mark," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe as if he had been expecting him. "What brings you over?" Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "Kevin, we need to talk about your car. I asked you yesterday to stop parking on my lawn. It's private property, and you're causing damage to the grass. I even left you a note." Kevin interrupted him with a laugh. "Yeah, I saw that. Look, Mark, it's just a lawn. Grass grows back. You're making a big deal out of nothing." Mark's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. It might just be grass to you, Kevin, but it's my property. I've spent time and money taking care of it. I'm asking you again. Please respect that and park your car somewhere else." Kevin took a swig of his beer and shrugged. "Why don't you just put up a fence if it bothers you so much? I mean, it's not like I'm hurting anyone. You've got plenty of lawn to spare." The sheer audacity of Kevin's response left Mark momentarily speechless. Did he really think this was acceptable behavior? Mark had approached him politely, explained his concerns, and yet Kevin seemed to take pleasure in dismissing him entirely. The smug grin on his face only fueled Mark's anger. "Kevin," Mark said, his tone firmer now, "this isn't about offense or about how much lawn I have. This is about respect. You can't just decide to use someone else's property as your personal parking lot." Kevin chuckled again, a sound that grated on Mark's nerves. "Relax, buddy. You're wound up too tight. I'll move it when I get around to it." With that, Kevin turned and walked back inside, shutting the door in Mark's face. Mark stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door in disbelief. His frustration had turned to outright anger. Kevin's blatant disregard for common courtesy was infuriating, but what made it worse was his apparent enjoyment of the situation. He wasn't just being careless, he was being deliberately antagonistic. Back at his house, Mark paced the living room, venting his frustration to his wife, Emma. She listened patiently, her brow furrowed in concern as he recounted the conversation. "He just doesn't care, Emma," Mark said, running a hand through his hair. "I tried being polite. I tried reasoning with him, but he acts like I'm the one being unreasonable. And now he's suggesting I put up a fence. Why should I have to spend money just to keep him off my property?" Emma reached out and placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You're right, Mark. This isn't fair, and you shouldn't have to put up with it. But maybe there's another way to handle this. Have you thought about contacting the city? There might be laws against this sort of thing." The idea gave Mark a glimmer of hope. He hated the thought of involving authorities, but if Kevin refused to listen to reason, what choice did he have? The next morning, Mark called the town's code enforcement office to explain the situation. He detailed how Kevin's car was damaging his lawn and asked if there was any legal recourse. The woman on the other end of the line listened sympathetically but ultimately delivered disappointing news. "Unfortunately, there aren't any specific ordinances against parking on private lawns," she explained. "Since it's your property, it would be considered a civil matter. You'd need to address it with your neighbor directly, or you could consult an attorney if it escalates." Mark thanked her and hung up, his heart sinking. He had hoped for a solution, but instead it felt like he was back at square one. Kevin clearly wasn't going to listen to polite requests, and now it seemed the authorities couldn't or wouldn't intervene. That afternoon, as Mark stepped outside to check the mail, he saw something that made his stomach drop. Kevin's car was back, but this time it wasn't alone. A second car, a large SUV, was now parked beside it, taking up even more space on his lawn. Deep tire ruts marred the grass, and the once vibrant green was now streaked with brown. Mark's blood boiled as he stared at the scene. This wasn't just thoughtlessness anymore. It was outright disrespect. Kevin wasn't just ignoring him. He was mocking him. The second car felt like a deliberate act, a way of saying, "What are you going to do about it?" Mark's first instinct was to march straight over to Kevin's house and demand he move the cars immediately. But as he stood there, staring at the damage, he realized that arguing with Kevin wasn't going to get him anywhere. The man thrived on confrontation, and engaging with him directly would only give him more satisfaction. No, Mark needed a different approach, one that Kevin wouldn't see coming. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Mark sat on his porch, deep in thought. The cool evening breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, but it did little to calm his simmering frustration. His mind raced with possibilities, each idea more creative than the last. He didn't know exactly what he would do yet, but one thing was certain. Kevin had underestimated him. Mark smiled to himself, a glimmer of determination lighting his eyes. Kevin might think he had won this little game, but he was about to learn a valuable lesson about underestimating the quiet neighbor next door. Mark's frustration had reached its peak. His polite approaches had failed, and Kevin's behavior was escalating into outright mockery. The sight of not one but two vehicles on his lawn, their tires sinking into the soft soil, was the last straw. Mark knew he had to act, but he needed a solution that didn't involve fruitless arguments or expensive legal battles. That evening, as he sat on his porch, staring at the damage to his once pristine lawn, inspiration struck. A clever, subtle way to reclaim his space without direct confrontation. The first step in Mark's plan was subtle but effective. He headed to a local hardware store the next morning and picked up a stack of small signs, the kind used for construction warnings or pesticide treatments. On each sign, he printed the words, "Caution, chemically treated lawn, avoid contact." The text was accompanied by a bright red warning symbol that would catch anyone's attention. When Mark installed the signs along the perimeter of his lawn, he took care to make them look official. He even scattered a few empty bags of lawn treatment products, completely harmless fertilizer, to sell the illusion. To the untrained eye, it appeared as though his lawn had been treated with something far more hazardous than it actually had been. It was a harmless deception, but it carried enough of a psychological edge to make anyone think twice before parking there. That afternoon, as Mark worked in his garage, he heard the familiar rumble of Kevin's car approaching. He didn't need to look to know that Kevin would try to park on the lawn again. It had become almost routine by this point. But this time, Mark heard the sound of tires slowing and then coming to a halt. He stepped out of the garage just in time to see Kevin leaning out of his car window, squinting at the new signs. "What's this about chemicals?" Kevin called out, his voice laced with suspicion. Mark smiled, wiping his hands on a rag as he strolled over. "Oh, just a new treatment I'm trying out," he said casually. "It's supposed to be great for the grass, but they recommend avoiding direct contact for a while. Don't want it getting on shoes or tires. It's tough to clean off." Kevin frowned, clearly thrown off by the new development. "You're saying it's not safe to park here?" Mark shrugged. "Well, I wouldn't risk it. But hey, it's your choice." Kevin hesitated for a moment, then reversed his car and parked in front of his own house instead. Mark watched him retreat, satisfaction bubbling just beneath his calm demeanor. For the first time in weeks, his lawn was free of Kevin's car. But Mark knew that Kevin wasn't the type to give up so easily. The signs were a deterrent, but they wouldn't be enough to stop him permanently. Mark needed a backup plan, something foolproof. That's when he remembered a trick he had seen in a landscaping magazine: installing ground-level deterrents. These were small, hidden spikes designed to discourage stray animals or unauthorized parking without damaging the grass. They were invisible from above but effective in stopping vehicles from trespassing. Over the next few days, Mark worked in the evenings, carefully placing the deterrents beneath the soil in strategic locations. The spikes were sturdy but shallow, designed to puncture tires only if significant weight was applied. To ensure they were safe for pedestrians, Mark marked their locations with small flags, removing them only once the deterrents were securely installed. His plan was now fully in place, and all he had to do was wait. The opportunity presented itself sooner than Mark expected. One afternoon, as he worked from home, he heard the familiar roar of Kevin's SUV. The car rolled up to the edge of his lawn and hesitated, as if Kevin were debating whether to test the signs. Mark watched from his window, holding his breath. Kevin's decision came swiftly. The SUV turned onto the lawn, its tires sinking slightly into the soft grass. Mark couldn't see Kevin's face, but he could imagine the smug grin as the car came to a stop. And then, it happened. The first hiss of escaping air was barely audible, but it was quickly followed by a louder, unmistakable pop. Kevin's car lurched slightly to one side as the front tire deflated. Then another hiss, this time from the back. Within moments, both front and rear tires on the driver's side were completely flat. Mark couldn't help the smile that spread across his face as he watched Kevin step out of the car, his expression shifting from confusion to fury. Kevin crouched down to inspect the tires, muttering curses under his breath. He kicked at the ground, his frustration mounting as he realized what had happened. Mark stepped outside, feigning concern. "Everything okay, Kevin?" he called out, his voice neutral. Kevin turned to glare at him. "What the hell is this? My tires are flat." Mark approached slowly, keeping his expression calm. "Oh no," he said, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. "I told you the lawn was treated. Maybe the chemicals weakened the rubber." Kevin looked like he was about to explode. "This isn't chemicals. Something popped my tires." Mark spread his hands in an innocent gesture. "Well, Kevin, I warned you about parking here. Maybe it's time to reconsider using my lawn as your personal driveway." Kevin stormed off, pulling out his phone to call for a tow truck. Mark watched him go, satisfied that his plan had worked. He knew Kevin would try to spin the incident in his favor, but with the signs and warnings he had put up, there was no way to pin the blame on him. For the first time in weeks, Mark felt a sense of victory. As Kevin's SUV was towed away, Mark took a deep breath and smiled. His lawn was once again his own, and Kevin had learned the hard way that there were consequences for disrespecting someone else's property. But Mark wasn't done yet. He knew Kevin's ego wouldn't let him back down so easily. The next battle might not involve cars, but Mark was ready for whatever came next. One thing was certain. Kevin would think twice before messing with him again. The satisfaction of seeing Kevin's deflated ego and tires was sweet, but Mark knew it was only a temporary victory. Kevin was the type of person who thrived on conflict, and Mark suspected this wouldn't be the end of his antics. Sure enough, the next morning, Kevin showed up on Mark's doorstep, his face flushed with indignation. "You think you're real clever, don't you?" Kevin spat, waving a piece of paper in Mark's face. "I've got the tow truck bill right here, and guess who's paying for it? You are." Mark raised an eyebrow, staying calm. "I don't know what you're talking about, Kevin. I've done everything I can to make it clear my lawn isn't for parking. The signs are up, and I even warned you directly. If you ignored all that, it's on you." Kevin's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "This is sabotage," he shouted. "You rigged your lawn with something to pop my tires. That's illegal, and I'll make sure you pay for it." Mark crossed his arms, his expression cool and measured. "Kevin, the only thing I've done is protect my property. If you'd like to take this further, be my guest. Just know that I have records of every conversation we've had, photos of the damage you've done to my lawn, and even footage from my security cameras showing you parking there despite all the warnings. So, by all means, let's escalate this if you'd like." Kevin's confidence wavered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, muttering under his breath as he stormed off. Mark knew this wouldn't be the end of it. Sure enough, 2 days later, a police officer knocked on Mark's door. Mark greeted the officer, a middle-aged man with a kind but professional demeanor, and invited him in. Kevin had filed a complaint, accusing Mark of intentionally damaging his vehicle. As the officer explained the allegations, Mark stayed calm and methodical, presenting his side of the story. "Officer, here's the situation," Mark began. "My neighbor has been parking on my lawn for weeks, despite repeated requests to stop. I've put up warning signs, spoken to him directly, and even called the city to confirm that my property is private and protected by law. He ignored all of that. I have security footage to back this up, as well as photos of the signs and the damage he's caused to my lawn." The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "And what about the claim that you sabotaged his vehicle?" Mark smiled slightly. "I installed ground-level deterrents to protect my lawn. Small, legal barriers designed to prevent cars from parking where they shouldn't. These are commonly used in landscaping to keep areas clear of unauthorized vehicles. They don't damage the grass or harm pedestrians, but they do discourage cars. I also made it clear through signs that my lawn was off-limits." Mark pulled up the security footage on his phone and showed the officer. The video clearly showed Kevin's SUV ignoring the warning signs and driving onto the lawn, followed by the tires deflating as the car came to a stop. The officer studied the footage, nodding thoughtfully. "Well," the officer said, "it seems like you've taken reasonable measures to protect your property. Your neighbor was aware of the warnings and chose to ignore them. I don't see any grounds for legal action against you." Mark let out a small sigh of relief as the officer continued. "I'll have a conversation with Mr. Kevin, is it? I'll explain that he needs to respect your property or face potential consequences. If this continues, you have every right to pursue your own legal action." Mark thanked the officer as he left, feeling a renewed sense of confidence. He had done everything by the book, and now even law enforcement was on his side. But Kevin's reaction later that evening was something Mark hadn't anticipated. Just as the sun was setting, Mark heard the familiar sound of Kevin's voice outside. Peeking through the curtains, he saw Kevin standing in his driveway shouting at another neighbor who had stopped to ask about the incident. Kevin's voice carried through the quiet evening air as he complained loudly about Mark's petty behavior and how the whole neighborhood was going downhill because of him. Instead of feeling angry, Mark felt something unexpected: pity. Kevin's attempts to turn the neighborhood against him were transparent and childish, and the neighbors weren't buying it. In fact, several of them had reached out to Mark privately to express their support. One neighbor, an older man named Jim, even stopped by to talk. "Don't let Kevin get to you," Jim said with a chuckle. "He's been causing trouble since he moved in. You're doing the right thing, standing up to him." Mark appreciated the support, but he knew the best way to truly end this conflict was to let Kevin's actions speak for themselves. Over the next week, Kevin's reputation in the neighborhood took a significant hit. People avoided him, tired of his antics and loud complaints. Meanwhile, Mark's lawn remained untouched. The final blow came when Kevin attempted to rally the neighborhood against Mark by calling for a community meeting. He wanted to propose new rules about shared spaces, claiming that Mark's actions were divisive. But when the meeting convened, it quickly became clear that Kevin was alone in his crusade. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their own frustrations with Kevin: his loud parties, his disregard for property lines, and his tendency to shirk responsibility. By the end of the meeting, Kevin was visibly deflated, his attempts to paint Mark as the villain completely backfiring. Afterward, Jim pulled Mark aside and grinned. "You didn't just win the battle, you won the war." Mark smiled, feeling a deep sense of relief. His lawn was finally his own again, and Kevin had learned the hard way that disrespect and arrogance wouldn't get him far. In the weeks that followed, life returned to normal. The grass on Mark's lawn began to recover, and the tire ruts slowly faded. Kevin, meanwhile, kept a low profile, avoiding Mark and the rest of the neighborhood. For Mark, the experience had been exhausting, but it also served as a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching his children play in the yard, Mark felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His lawn wasn't just a patch of grass. It was a symbol of his hard work, his family's home, and his refusal to be pushed around. And now, thanks to his determination and a little cleverness, it was finally his again.